Hello and welcome to the Empowered Couples Podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman.
And I'm Jocelyn Freeman, but you all just know us as the Freemans.
And this episode is about the pursue withdraw pattern, why partners disengage rather than open up.
All right, the pursue withdraw pattern is going to speak to a lot of you because this affects a lot of couples. Maybe not in all seasons, but definitely in some. And, ultimately in a relationship, no matter the challenge or the topic that you're really trying to work through, maybe it's parenting, maybe it's a financial decision, maybe it's just overall a hard season for you too, right? There's some kind of a hard conversation happening. That's been the theme lately, right? Aaron is talking about hard conversations, feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, if you've been following along, we shared, and it's probably even more I shared, that last week was one of the hardest weeks I've had, not specifically in the marriage, but from an outside investment that was being mismanaged and not going well, and that's triggering a lot of patterns for me. Then what brings us here today really is, I had a lot of emotion going on, and for really 4 days just about, I was bringing that energy back home. And now being where we are now on this, I really do see that for many of you listening, if your partner is going off to a stressful job and they are bringing that back home, like I'm really getting the impact that has, because I was starting to bring that energy to you, which is impacting you. And I'm like watching that happen, even though there was I wasn't able to transform that in those 3 days. But I do want to say this. Wednesday night, you had more of a straight conversation with me. You can add the details as you remember them, but the main thing that stood out to me was you mentioned, like in a bold manner, hey, you're letting this circumstance make you smaller rather than have you get bigger. And if for those of you listening, you probably get it. That's kind of like a personal development type of saying, but it's like shrinking yourself, becoming a smaller person, and the challenge is bigger than you. Or when challenges happen, you can rise above it, might be one way to say it. You become greater than it. You get resourceful, you get creative, whatever that is. Now, when you said that, I realized there were a number of things that flashed in my mind, and that conversation could have went a bunch of different ways.
You mean like you could have been fighting back to me or something?
And put yourself in my shoes. You listening, if your partner was really straight with you about, hey, your energy is really impacting me in the home and you're letting this make you small rather than get big, right? So this is one of those hard conversations, because as we go into pursue withdraw, it is about either one person just needs to talk about something, or they're unrepaired, or they're feeling disconnected, hence why they want to have this conversation, and it typically is a hard one. So for me, I'm sitting there and I realize this is one of those moments. I'm like, this is a hard conversation. It was funny that I thought that to myself, because right in that moment I could have shut down, I could have withdrawn, could have not said anything. On the flip side, I could have started to say, well, I'm happy to, you go do the work then. You go do that.
Yeah.
You got us into
Fight
this. So
back.
you go ahead and handle it then, and I'll stay here. So whatever it is, right, I realized, wow, this is that moment where it's a hard conversation, and this typically probably goes many different ways for you as you're listening.
Yeah, and we have cultivated over the years what we're calling a safe space between us. And so there was permission for that, right? Like it wouldn't go as well if I just came at you with that.
I think is what you mean. Like the permission is there. Sometimes you need to request, hey, can I share something with you?
Yes.
But you're saying ours is kind of open-ended.
Yeah, we've created a safe space between us. We know that we're on each other's side, and that's what we're going to be talking about in our web class next week, is how to cultivate that safe space where you can have any conversation. You can give each other input, feedback, say the tough things, and it doesn't feel as though you have to protect yourself. So we're going to be going into that in the web class. However, yes, go ahead.
Well, take us into the pursue withdraw pattern. So I think the listener here is getting what it is, but take us a little bit further on like why that happens and what that really looks like.
Yeah, so just as a summary, the pursue withdrawal pattern is when one partner in particular is feeling more anxious, more emotional, more unsettled about a disconnect that they're feeling in the relationship. And that disconnect could be just not feeling emotionally connected or feeling as though there's some elephant in the room and we haven't talked about this and this is on my mind and we got to talk about this. And then the other partner is feeling overwhelmed by the emotion and the energy that they're kind of receiving and maybe even struggling a bit too with the disconnect or the challenge. However, it feels safer to them to withdraw. And so it even becomes this vicious cycle and gets amplified because the more the person withdraws, the more the pursuer pursues. And then the more that person pursues, the more the other person wants to withdraw. And it just becomes more intensified and creates more and more of a disconnect and frustration. And then it feels like, how are we going to get out of this? And then that's when people even just start to be like, this isn't working. I mean, it just starts to really build up from there.
And I was just thinking about this because for us, I would say if we had to put ourselves into this pattern, then I would have in the past been the withdrawer and you been the pursuer.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know for sure if it's always like the same. My guess is that when there's emotion is high, you probably have a default pattern of yours. So you might, listening to this, fall more regularly into one of these patterns. But one of the key things that you were talking about, there's this feeling of being isolated from the pursuer side as the partner withdraws. So they start to feel isolated. But the interesting thing is, if this is you, you also feel that you don't have control. That is an interesting thing because of all the coaching we do. Control, you think, is usually the one that's more verbally outgoing, but it's actually not true. Oftentimes, the withdrawer, the person that's shutting down, it feels to the other partner that they have the control because they're dictating the terms of when conversations can happen or not.
Exactly.
So then that amplifies, I don't have control here. I'm feeling pushed out and isolated. I'm not going to get this resolved for myself internally. So then they continue to pursue. And oftentimes it's not just happening like as you're standing next to each other. The withdrawer might go to another room. So then, as it suggests, you walk with them. So this is where I feel this or had felt this sometimes. This is where a boundary being crossed really starts to take hold and start to escalate. Because now you're like being chased.
Yeah, that's when like the pursuer is literally pursuing. Like you're withdrawing, walking out of the room, and the pursuer is actually following and continuing to talk at the person. And so in this pursue withdrawal pattern can be a momentary thing, like right then in the conflict, following the person, but also it can just be the dynamic between you two in this season of life where the other person's really shut down, not opening up, not talking. I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it. And the other person's like, come on, we got to talk. So that
in those moments, just to finish that, because that's where I've found myself before, when you're the withdrawer and you have this person pursuing you, it literally feels like, wait, what's the word you use? Because you use this word sometimes.
Like, gosh.
It's the boundary being crossed, but it's something around being like
Dishonored?
traumatized, or I can't remember exactly what it is. But that's the feeling too, right? Because as they keep on pushing and pushing, you might stonewall.
Violated, kind of.
Violated, but eventually, as the withdrawer, you get so emotionally flooded, that's the psychology term, that your body starts to almost pulse and vibrate as if you're like trapped. And this is that feeling of like literally an animal being backed into a corner and then needing to fight for its life.
Wow.
So that gets to a place where the withdrawer is withdrawing, shutting down, but the emotional flood will eventually lead to this huge reaction. Like, you better get off of me. And I just want to say that part because that's where this dynamic can eventually go.
Yeah. And in terms of what creates this dynamic, it can either be these patterns that you've brought into the relationship. We've talked about this on a bunch of episodes. Like, we all come in with certain patterns, and those come from usually our upbringing and some of our formative romantic relationships. So there's a certain way you operate when there's a challenge, and that could be a challenge meaning you're disconnected in this season, or there's a certain topic you two really need to talk through and it's a hard conversation. And so you come in with these patterns, but also this could just be a pattern that you two actually create within the relationship. Maybe it wasn't like this the first few years. And then there's been certain ways you've been operating and, communicating with each other and not having these important conversations that have snowballed now to where this is the dynamic that you two created. And that's actually one of the first kind of steps for you to really take away from this is you two would need, in order to break this, in order to change this, because obviously this has got to discontinue. Like, this isn't a pattern you want to continue with. You both need to recognize that you co-created this dynamic. You both are contributing to not having emotional safety. That's the way we like to summarize it. That's what we're going to be talking about in the web class a lot, is there's a way you two have been operating with each other that has not created the emotional safety to where you two can actually sit down and have the hard conversations. We're going to get straight with you guys next week. You got to be having these conversations. There can't be these topics that you just don't talk about because it's uncomfortable. That is only going to lead to disconnect, to just feeling like there's surprise arguments. Like, you have to confront these things in your relationship. And so if you aren't able to do that with each other now, and it is this pursue withdrawal, hey, we're kind of avoiding the elephant in the room thing right now, you two co-created that space where there isn't emotional safety and feeling as though you can really talk about things.
So kind of summarizing the steps to take away, I think what you're saying is, as a listener, you need to really sit down with your partner and both take responsibility that you co-created this dynamic. Mm-hmm. I like steps, I like numbers. So that's the first thing. The second thing you mentioned was you have to create emotional safety so these conversations can be had in the future. And the way you do that is more simply to make agreements. Make agreements for these times of hard conversations. Now, what do these agreements sound like? Well, it's probably starting with saying, hey, I like to make the agreement that even when we're going to have a hard conversation, there's no walking out. There's no just turning your back and leaving the room, at least without requesting a time to pause. You might say, hey, I just need some time to emotionally process this, think this through, which is perfectly acceptable. You've heard us say this a lot. You can request the pause, but then set the time to come back to it. Then the pursuer role would want to make the agreement that they're not going to actually pursue. You're not going to, if we request a timeout, it's got to get honored. You don't follow me. Neither of us are going to follow each other, right? I like to say the we rather than you're not going to follow me into other rooms. But you're not going to follow each other. You're not going to pursue. You're not going to force the conversation and have your partner get emotionally flooded. And you're going to, I have to say this part too, you have to stop the last word in mentality.
I had to do this. I really used to just be like, I got one more thing to say and I'm going to get it in and it's going to be the last zinger.
Because there was a couple of times, I don't know, we've done this probably for the last 2 years, but even as we were implementing all of these skills that we teach, I would request the pause. We would set the time to come back, and I would start to get into another room, and I'd hear you say something else, and that it just is another trigger.
Well, and it doesn't create the safety. What I realized was, if I'm wanting you to engage, right? We're talking about having you not disengage and withdraw from these conversations. Then the last thing I need to do is throw you these zingers, at you.
From another room, typically. Sorry, this reminds me, we were watching Anchorman 2 last night, even though you fell asleep within 15 minutes now. I'm at 30 minutes. But in Anchorman 2, they were across the room, and Will Ferrell was just talking to his crew about the other anchor guy, and he's way far away, and then he's all of a sudden what'd you say? what was that? Will Ferrell was like, nothing. No, I heard you say something.
Right.
So it reminded me of that pattern, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is something we've had to work on. Again, we're not coming on here as these perfect humans, but we have made, I mean, I haven't done that in a long time because I realized how much that did cross your boundaries. And you did say that as like a summary in terms of it's about creating agreements. However, in the web class, we're going to go so much more into these values and how to really show your partner that you are a safe person. Because, you know, I think the deeper question to ask is, when did you two stop being safe for each other? When did you stop being that landing, you know, like a place you can land and have these harder, vulnerable, more uncomfortable conversations? That had to happen at some point in the partnership. And so we're going to be talking about these values and really how to exude that to your partner and how to create that together again. So it's not just agreements. It's like so much more than that to create that dynamic in the partnership. Also,
well, so when and where is this?
Oh,
web
yes,
class?
you're right. Thank you. So the web class is going to be next Wednesday if you're listening to this episode the week that it's posted. So it's going to be August 17th in the evening Pacific Standard Time. You'll be able to register at onlinecouplesworkshops.com. Already see hundreds of you signed up, and it's going to be powerful. And look, we know some of you really value privacy. You don't have to talk on the web class. You don't even have to have your faces seen, your name seen. Like, you can just be on there and watch and, you know, type in the chat if you want to. You know, so privacy is really important to us, but go to onlinecouplesworkshops.com. We're going to be talking about having hard conversations that are constructive, how to create emotional safety, how to have these conversations create closeness. I mean, that's what we all ultimately want, is to be close to this person, right? You don't want just a roommate. You don't want just this person that you kind of manage life with. You want closeness and intimacy. And we are going to teach you the framework to be able to have any kind of conversation lead to closeness rather than disconnect.
So until that, I just wanted to give a last couple bonus tips. You know, at some point when you're actually in the hard conversation, one of the things you're going to want to say is how I'm feeling right now. You really want to bring it to expressing and sharing about yourself, which is obviously going to be different than you react or you blame the other person.
Yes.
You blame your partner for the strong emotions you are feeling. Mm-hmm. You got us into this. It was your tone of voice. It was your decision making.
You're this way, you're that way.
Mm-hmm. Labeling them, labeling their character, their person. You're just like your moms. All of that stuff. Turn it back around. You just want to start to share, hey, how I'm feeling. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling like I need some time. I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling anxious. Mm-hmm. So you make it about yourself, because then there's no true or false here, right? There's no right or wrong. And that's one of the places couples get stuck, is what's true, what's fact, what's false, what's logical. None of that matters when you're sharing, this is how I feel. There's no negating that. This is just how I feel. No one can ever negate that.
Well, and I think it's about going deeper into the feelings. Part of having these harder conversations go constructively is that you're actually discussing feelings and not arguing over facts, because you're not going to always see the facts the same way. And so it's getting more vulnerable. Hey, I haven't been feeling loved. Hey, I haven't been feeling heard. You know, so going deeper into that, and that's part of emotional agility. You know, so like the next step is really like what we talked about on the podcast last week, is really having a better relationship with your own emotions. If you two are going to sit down and have these important conversations, you can't just be reacting to your partner from your triggers and just like, if you're wanting your partner to engage, but the moment that they engage and actually have this conversation, you attack because they say something that triggers you, it's instantly over. Right? Like, you've negated everything that you're wanting. And so that emotional agility is being able to be in the moment, recognize what you're feeling, not act from the feeling, and really choose a better response and way to keep them engaged and keep them opening up.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot around that too. I mean, in the beginning, you might have to get better at labeling your own emotions. You know, listen to the Emotional Agility podcast, which was, I think, just last week. Mm-hmm. You need to take it from these big ideas of emotions and start to give yourself a language, a terminology to better describe the smaller emotions that you're feeling, because then you can create your values, You can identify what is important to you and use those as emotional signals to actually create from.
So another big one, in order to prevent the pursue withdrawal pattern from coming back, because it could be something you work through and then all of a sudden you get back into this dynamic, you have to be proactively asserting your needs and your wants. Part of why this dynamic gets created is because you go through so long of not expressing things to each other, not talking about it, and then all this resentment gets built up, these unmet needs, dissatisfaction, and now there's just so much pent up energy, as opposed to just like we did a reel, it's been probably over a month ago now, about talk about it when it's a seed, not a weed. Right? When it's a seed, it's something small, it's still important, but it's not become this huge weed that's grown and you're now frustrated and angry. And so proactively asserting your wants, your needs, you use the pop bottle analogy, right?
Yeah, well, start to think of your conversations with your partner as, well, I guess, first of all, think of a pop bottle that you shake up. Right? And it builds pressure in there. Now, at some point, the top is going to explode. And think of your communication actually as untwisting the top of it and letting a little bit of the pressure out. And the bottle doesn't have to be like at the brink, but as you let a little bit of pressure out, which is through your assertiveness, through you asking for what you need and want, sharing how you feel, all of that is proactively keeping this level of pressure down. Your level of understanding is up. Your assertiveness is up. From the assessments that we do, that lowers your feeling of control and being dominated by your partner. So that's how we want you to think of the conversations with your partner. You're not just talking about the activities and the tasks, but you want to see your partner and see each other as the place to undo some of the pressure that's building up within you.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, don't just jump right to that, because you need to have some of the other things we talked about in place. Like, you have to know that your partner's going to receive what you're going to say. You want to share from your own perspective. You're going to need some agreements, right? Because otherwise, you don't just come home and dump on your partner if you don't have all these other things.
Opening up.
Yeah. Well, the Freemans told me I should just use my communication to undo my pop bottle, and then you just unload on them. No, you have to have some other things in place, but see your ongoing communication as the ways to keep these bigger like blind sides and keep these bigger reactions from coming up, to where you're not going to actually feel like you have to have that many hard conversations.
Yeah, they're prevented. Like, it's a seed, it's not a weed.
There you go.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I think we really close out with just some reminders that any dynamic in your partnership, you can't blame on just one of you. There is a part that you played, and maybe you don't know the part you played. Maybe that even feels hard to hear, because it's like, no, Freemans, I don't. But you got to ask your partner, hey, how have I contributed to the fact that you don't feel you can open up to me, or that you don't feel we can have this conversation about this? So we're going to go into all that on the web class. If this really spoke to you and you're like, yes, we do this, I'm the pursuer, they're the withdrawal, or vice versa, just attend the web class. Like, we are putting so much heart into this, so many great tools. It's going to really resonate with so many of you and the common challenges we hear from couples. So again, go to onlinecouplesworkshops.com. And, really, as a couple, you're going to create closeness by having these harder conversations. Don't avoid them. That's where intimacy exists, in the uncomfortable zone, right? Intimacy isn't just in, having a nice date. You're having a meaningful conversation. That's what really creates intimacy. So with that, everyone, we love you. We are here to support you. You're not alone. Let's continue to get better and better as people and as partners, and we will talk to you on the next episode.